Hey, what's good,
50
YouTube? It's
years,
your boy
over
saying I'm back
$1.2
with another
trillion
video.
of aid money has been poured into Africa,
back with
more than the entire GDP of countries like Spain, Australia, or South Korea. When all of this began, just 11% of Africa lived in poverty. But by the 1990s,
Only
after floods
11?
of money and global campaigns, that number had actually increased to 66%. And today it stands at 38%,
Damn.
over 3 times higher than when the aid program started.
Yo,
In fact,
that's
back in the
actually so
1950s,
crazy.
the average Western European was just 5 times richer than the average African. Now the gap has more than doubled to 13
Damn.
times. Today,
Bro,
over
everything just
half
keeps
of
on
all
getting
Africans
worse,
still
bro.
live
What
on
the
less
hell?
than $5.50 a day,
Bro,
and
how
nearly
is there
600 million
more-
people
bro, how is
don't
there
have access to
1.5
electricity.
trillion dollars
That's
going
not to say
into
this is an
a
entirely
country?
recent phenomenon. Africa has always been
And
poorer
there
than the
is
rest of the world,
nothing
at least
getting
for the
better,
past 300
everything's
years.
getting worse.
But for decades, the West's answer to this has been simple. The reason they're poor is because they don't have enough money, and to fix that, we simply just need to give them more. So that's
Right,
exactly
right.
what's happened. Since the 1960s,
Right.
the amount of aid going into Africa
Sure.
has increased by nearly 120 times. It's easy to see why this is such a popular strategy. It's simple. When we think of aid, we imagine
It is.
schools being built, roads being paved, children being vaccinated. By and large, this is the strategy that transformed Europe and America into the powerhouses they are today. But in Africa, it doesn't seem to work. The obvious answer that many people turn to is colonialism. Europe wrecked the continent, leaving economic systems so bad that the rise of dictators and corruption was inevitable. And while there's no denying that fleets of luxury cars and presidential jets, while around 30% of the continent lives without clean water, certainly doesn't help, there's more to the story. And a growing body of research is showing that the money being given to Africa isn't just being wasted, it's actually making the continent poorer. But the truth is that decades of Western involvement might be the one thing holding Africa
That's
back.
facts.
This is how
just
aid
thinking
laid
that.
the foundation for the biggest humanitarian failure of the modern era. For a time, foreign aid was seen as a kind of magic bullet, a surefire way to lift the continent of Africa out of extreme poverty.
Oh,
And to
wow.
be fair, by the 1960s, there was a good reason to think this.
Ooh,
The one major
yeah.
instant where it had been tried, it worked
Pass it
remarkably
down,
well.
pass it down, pass it down.
After World War II,
stupid
Europe
ass.
was left decimated, and
Pass
all of
it
this
down,
came with a
pass
massive
it down,
geopolitical
pass it
risk.
down, head ass.
Across Western Europe, communist parties were quickly gaining popularity, and there was a real risk that without a strong economy, Western Europe could turn to communism, or
Damn.
worse, be invaded by the Soviet Union. For the
Oh,
US, this would have been a disaster. So in 1947, the government announced one of the most ambitious economic programs in human history, the Marshall Plan. Between 1948 and 1952, the US pumped over $13 billion into Europe, roughly
Bro,
$160 billion in today's money.
$13
The idea was that by providing Europe with large amounts of cash, America could kickstart investment in the economy. And surprisingly,
hell
it worked. In the decade after the Marshall Plan, GDP per capita across the region grew by almost 35%. For the Western world, this was a massive success. But for America, it also represented a turning point. It realized that through aid, it could make
Europe
countries
ain't
rich,
Africa,
and in doing so,
baby.
create both new trading partners and long-term allies in the fight against communism. So after the success of the Marshall
should've
Plan,
just left
the US
Africa
looked at
alone,
another
boy.
continent, Africa. At the time, the continent was still reeling from centuries
Y'all
of
ruined
colonialism.
Africa, bro.
In 1960,
With all that
the average income
colonialism
in sub-Saharan
bullshit.
Africa was less than $150 a
But
year,
it is what
and
it
literacy
is, dude.
rates were under 30%, with life expectancy hovering around 45
It
years.
all happened
Most
for
of the
a reason,
continent
you know
lacked
what I'm
paved
saying?
roads, electricity grids, or functioning governments. But it also had something America wanted: natural resources.
Yep,
The continent
of
held
course.
massive reserves of oil, copper, diamonds, and rare minerals. With a rapidly growing population, it was seen as a future economic giant. If America could
Economic
repeat the success of the Marshall Plan, it could unlock a new economic frontier and build a key ally in the process. So the money started flowing.
Word
In the
indeed.
1960s, sub-Saharan Africa was receiving $500 million in aid every year.
Damn.
But by the 1990s, that number had increased 40 times to almost 20 billion. Africa quickly became the most aid-dependent
20
region
billion,
on
bro.
Earth. And by the 90s, aid money made up over 60% of government budgets in countries
Bro.
like Uganda, Mali, and Burkina Faso. But despite this massive injection of
dude.
cash, things were actually getting worse. In fact, from 1970 to 2000, the average income in Africa declined, despite receiving almost 600
God damn.
billion over this time period. But rather than changing approach, the West doubled down. In 2005, the UN launched the Millennium Development Goals, and the G8
that's
promised
so
to double aid to Africa, with the end of aiming poverty by 2030.
Right.
This wasn't just a government strategy anymore, it had become a public movement. Campaigns like Comic Relief in the UK, Live Aid, and Band-Aid's Feed the World turned Africa into a moral crusade. Ordinary citizens were donating millions, schools held fundraisers, and celebrities sang charity singles,
Damn, bro,
all
that's
under the
crazy.
belief that sending money would fix the problem. That all created a powerful narrative, that poverty in Africa wasn't about politics, corruption, or bad governance, it was simply about a lack of money. And
That's
if we
all
just
they
gave
thought,
enough of
bro.
it, we
People
could
think
solve
money
that
is
problem.
everything.
By 2010, aid flows to Africa had reached over $50 billion a year, the highest
Damn.
level in history. Yet nearly 2 decades later, those efforts have fallen dramatically short. 400 million Africans still live on less than $2 a day, the highest
Less
number
than
in history,
$2 a
and the
day,
continent's
bro.
share of global trade remains below 3%, and many countries now are poorer than when they were in the 1980s. All of that raises the pretty obvious question: why did aid manage to kickstart the European economy but totally fail to do the same in Africa?
That's a good question.
Like always,
bro.
a range of ideas have been proposed, from the continent's geography to its colonial history. But in the last few years, one school of thought has gained particular attention amongst development experts. Their idea is simple. It can all be explained by something economists refer to as institutions. These are the frameworks that govern
Okay.
societies, things like the rule of law, property rights, and democracy. And they might be the single most important factor when it comes to explaining why aid might be made. When the Marshall Plan began in Western Europe, Europe had the infrastructure of functioning states.
Nah, facts.
Ministries,
facts.
legal
I'm about to
systems,
say
and
Europe
public
already
institutions,
built.
though
They
damaged,
already
had
had
existed
everything
for
built
decades.
up.
These institutions provided the framework needed to rebuild. They could collect taxes,
Facts.
distribute resources, and enforce laws. All essential functions for a stable and functioning
Yeah, but
society.
they already had
But in
all
much
that.
of Africa, the picture was very different. Most African states had only recently gained independence, and
Facts.
governments were either newly formed or inherited from colonial administrations.
Facts.
But in both cases, the institutions were generally designed for one purpose: to extract wealth. Unlike most Western democracies, states function almost entirely to serve the interests of the ruling elite. Indexes tracking the quality of government institutions have consistently found African countries near the bottom of the list. In 2025, African nations made nearly half of the bottom 30 countries on the Polity Democracy ranking. It's not hard to imagine why pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into these states goes wrong. Money that was meant to fund roads, schools, hospitals, electrification
always gonna
often goes
send,
straight to the hands of the ruling elites.
Yep.
Presidents who fly
exactly.
private jets to international conferences, or
Exactly.
government ministers spotted wearing $60,000 Rolex watches during anti-poverty meetings. Estimates suggest that the continent loses around 30 billion every year due to corruption, and 30% of all the aid money it
Of
receives.
course.
Over the past 50 years, this could amount to hundreds of billions of dollars being stolen.
Oh
But the problem isn't
my
just that this money
God.
is effectively being wasted, it also actively supports the very institutions that make development so
Bro,
hard.
I mean, I would.
In a normal
bro,
democracy,
it would
governments
just
are
make
funded
sense.
through taxes, and that creates a two-way relationship between the state and the people. When the people pay taxes, they expect services in return, and if the ruling class fails to provide this, then they run the risk of people demanding a
Yeah.
new government. But in
Yeah,
aid-dependent countries, this accountability mechanism is broken. Because governments receive their funding from foreign donors,
Yep.
it doesn't really matter what the people of the country think.
Exactly.
And so corruption is able to persist with very little domestic resistance.
Yo, Africa
This
is
pretty much
crazy.
sums up the continent's political process for the past 50 years. Take Malawi,
Damn.
for example. At various points in the 2000s and early 2010s, foreign aid made up more than 40% of the national budget.
40%.
Huge amounts of money was being stolen by government officials,
Shit.
paying for things like luxury cars, private homes, or even international shopping trips.
God
You might expect
damn.
a scandal to spark mass outrage, and after all, the government was siphoning off millions that were meant to serve the public. But that simply never happened, because there was basically no political fallout. As the government's funding came from foreign sources, the people most affected by the mismanagement of public funds, the Malawian citizens, had very little power to demand systemic change. This isn't unique to Malawi.
God
The same
damn.
dynamic has been occurring across the continent for
course.
decades.
I mean,
and
I
it
believe
in
it.
part explains why the country still has such high levels of corruption. Of course, some level of corruption exists in basically every country, especially
That's
during their early development stages. But even under these circumstances, a country can usually still achieve economic development. Small businesses, farmers, and entrepreneurs can drive progress from the ground up. creating jobs and expanding access to goods and services without relying heavily on the state. But this is another one of the main problems
Facts.
with aid. It makes ground-up work much harder. Because aid makes this route of development far less likely. That's because, more often than not, the things being provided by aid organisations are in direct competition with local businesses. Take the textiles industry. By the early 2000s, nearly 80% of the clothing sold in some African nations came from abroad. At first, that might seem like a win-win. Clothes were cheap, and aid organisations feel good about reducing waste in Western countries. But the effect on local African industry was devastating. In Ghana alone, over 80% of domestic textile factories shut down between 1990 and 2010, which meant thousands of jobs disappearing. And with them, so did the knowledge, machinery, and networks needed to sustain a homegrown industry. In fact, in the last 2 decades, Africa's industrial sector has shrunk from 15% of the continent's economy to now just 10%. This isn't a coincidence. Academic research has found that on average, foreign aid hurts industrialization in Africa. Even the World Bank, one of the biggest aid organizations in the world, found that periods of increased aid tend to weaken local manufacturing. But it's not just domestic industries that suffer. The entire structure of the economy can be distorted in ways that make economic growth far less likely.
Fact.
To understand why, it helps to look at how countries actually grow rich. In the last few decades, almost every country that has achieved rapid development has done so through an export-led model. Nations like South Korea, Taiwan, and China have all seen huge amounts of economic growth in the past few decades, and they did this offering low-cost goods that appealed to Western consumers and then selling them on the international markets. Over time, this allowed them to industrialize, build up domestic industries, and eventually move up the value chain. But there is an essential part of the process that people tend to forget: maintaining a weak currency. Doing this makes the country's exports cheaper on the global market and boosting demand from foreign buyers. This increased demand then helps local industries grow, creating jobs and bringing in valuable foreign income, further fueling development. But aid money creates the opposite effect. When money flows into the country, it needs to be converted into the local currency so that governments and aid organisations can actually spend it. But doing this pushes up the price of the currency on foreign exchange markets in response to the higher demand. Having a more valuable currency may not sound like a bad thing, but it actually causes a serious problem. A more expensive currency means that for foreigners trying to buy a country's produce, everything suddenly becomes more expensive, so people simply stop buying the produce. For developing economies, this is a total disaster. It means the export-led model that worked so successfully in East Asia becomes impossible to replicate. In Africa today, exports account for about 20% of the average GDP. Less than half of most successful East Asian economies, like Hong Kong, South Korea, or Taiwan.
That is so crazy, bro.
Instead of developing competitive industries and shipping products around the world, aid-dependent countries end up relying on foreign assistance to survive, while their domestic economies remain uncompetitive and underdeveloped. Of course, that's not to say there's no good that aid can do. In theory, it has the potential to fill crucial gaps in development, things like building roads, schools, and power grids, all facilitating domestic economic expansion. But that brings us to the final and potentially most serious issue with foreign aid. It almost never effectively delivers. A 2012 report by the Center for Global Development found that up to 70% of aid projects either failed to meet their targets or had no measurable impact. In some sectors, the waste was staggering. An audit of health aid in Uganda found that nearly 1/3 of donated medical supplies never reached their intended recipients, lost to theft, mismanagement, or simple logistical failure. In Haiti, after the 2010 earthquake, billions in aid flowed in, yet less than 10% of it reached local institutions. Most was routed through foreign contractors, NGOs, or overhead costs. And more than a decade later, many communities still lack basic sanitation or permanent housing. To understand why, it's helpful to look at the systems that function effectively. Take a business operating in a competitive market. If it provides a bad product, consumers will simply switch to its competitors, and the firm's revenues drop. And if it doesn't make changes, it may even end up going bankrupt. The point is that people who are providing the product are accountable to the people who end up actually using it. But foreign aid doesn't work that way. If a project fails, the recipients can withhold their taxes or vote for someone else. Because funding comes from foreign governments or donors, there's no mechanism for rewarding success or punishing failure. The result is an enormous lack of incentives to actually do things well. And the story of foreign aid in Africa is not simply one of failure, but of misplaced assumptions. What began as an effort to lift nations out of poverty has created systems of dependence, weakened institutions, and stifled local industries. That doesn't mean that aid has no role to play. In moments of crisis, like famine, conflict, or natural disasters, it can
Facts.
provide vital short-term relief. But as a
That's facts.
long-term development strategy, the evidence is hard to ignore.
That's
Aid
facts.
has not delivered the
I believe it.
transformation it's promised. If the goal is to support
believe it,
sustainable
bro.
growth, then the focus needs to shift toward
Facts.
building strong institutions, supporting local business,
Africa gotta
and
start
creating
developing
systems where
itself,
governments
bro,
are
from
accountable
the
to their
inside.
people, not to foreign
From the
donors.
inside out.
Because until that happens, the cycle of dependency is just going to continue.
It's just gonna make it worse, man. Damn.
Latin America is changing.
Yo, prayers for Africa, bro. And I'm gonna catch y'all in the next video.